All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join this session. In today's session, we'll be discussing a very important topic today, that is why technical controls make or break your compliance. But before we get into the depths of the topic, let me quickly introduce myself. I am Nilab Kulshresht. I'm a consultant working with CyberCube Services for over 6 years of experience in audit and compliances. This particular session is intentionally designed from a very specific perspective, not from a framework interpretation standpoint, not from a consulting standpoint, and not from a theoretical security standpoint. But today, I'm speaking from the auditor's desk. Over the past several years, working across multiple compliances environments like PCI DSS assessments, ISO 27001 audits, SOC environments, and regulatory reviews, one observation has remained remarkably consistent. Organizations rarely struggle with compliances because policies are missing, or they rarely struggle because procedures are undefined. The main pain point or the main pain area for organizations struggle is the technical controls, because technical controls do not behave the way management believes the way they are behaving. There is often a significant difference between what management believes is implemented and what documentation states is implemented within the organization's environment, and what's actually operating inside the environment as well. And it is inside that particular gap between perception and reality where compliance failures are mostly originating. But most importantly, that is also where security incidents originate for an organization. One of the biggest misconceptions about compliance is the idea that documentation creates an assurance. Documentation itself does not create any kind of assurance. Documents only explain the intentions of a particular control. Technical implementations are what demonstrates reality. Auditors are trained to evaluate the reality, not the intentions. Over time, environments accumulate small technical weaknesses. For example, a firewall rule that was never cleaned up, a privileged account that bypassed multi-factor authentication, a logging source that stopped forwarding events, or a vulnerability that remained open for longer than expected. Individually, these particular gaps or these particular vulnerabilities appear minor, but collectively, they can erode the assurance of the organization. And what often surprises organization is that audit observations appear when audit observations are appear, they feel sudden, right? Like if we talk from an auditor's perspective, those particular observations represent weaknesses and they have existed for months and sometimes years. Compliance failures themselves rarely begin during a particular audit activity. They begin long before the auditor arrives. Today's session is about understanding why auditors insist on certain technical activities and what we are actually validating when we review those particular activities. This session is not about passing audits. This session is about control integrity. Over the last decade, organizations have matured significantly in their compliance readiness. Most environments today include documented security policies, defined procedures, assigned ownership, security tooling, monitoring dashboards, etc. If we compare modern environments with the environments from 10 to 15 years ago, the maturity improvement has been significant. And yet, audit observations continue. Security incidents continue. Regulatory penalties also continue. This tells us something very important. The presence of control does not guarantee the effectiveness of that particular control. For example, a SIEM deployment does not guarantee detection. A firewall deployment does not guarantee segmentation. A vulnerability scanning tool does not guarantee remediation. A backup system does not guarantee the recovery. From an auditor's standpoint, one of the most important distinctions is the difference between the evidence and effectiveness. Evidence demonstrates that the process has occurred, whereas effectiveness demonstrates that the risk was reduced for that particular process. A screenshot showing that logs exist demonstrates the activity. It does not demonstrate the monitoring effectiveness of that particular control. A vulnerability scan report demonstrates that the scanning has occurred within a particular environment, but it does not demonstrate the exposure reduction. This distinction is fundamental because organizations optimize for evidence collection, but auditors evaluate effectiveness. Evidence will prove that the activity is occurring. However, validation will prove its effectiveness. Other common patterns that auditors observe is the creation of false assurance environments. These are the environments where tools are being deployed, processes exist, documentation also exists, but the controls do not operate reliably. For example, a SIEM platform may collect logs from hundreds of systems, but if alert thresholds are poorly turned, then alerts are not investigated consistently. Detection capability will always remain uncertain. A firewall may be deployed at every network boundary, but if the rule scope are overly permissive, segmentation will become theoretical for that particular firewall. A vulnerability management program may exist, but if remediation timelines are inconsistent, the exposure will persist. From an auditor's perspective, the purpose of an audit is not to confirm that the controls are existing. The purpose of an audit is to determine whether risk is being actively reduced. Compliance is not just a documentation exercise, it's a structured validation of risk reduction. To understand why auditors insist on technical activities, it is important to understand how controls are being evaluated. Every technical control, regardless of the framework, is evaluated across 4 dimensions. These 4 dimensions determine whether a control actually provides assurance or not. First up, we have the design adequacy. So design adequacy answers a very simple question. Does the control actually addresses the intended risk? A control can be perfectly documented and consistently operated, but if the design is weak, assurance remains weak. For example, if privileged administrators can disable logging mechanisms without detection, the logging control is poorly designed. If segmentation relies only on logical VLAN separations without firewall enforcement, then in that particular case, segmentation design is also weak. If vulnerability scanning excludes production environment due to operational concerns, exposure remains unmanaged. Weak design creates a structural gap, and structural gaps cannot be compensated by the operational discipline. The second dimension that we will be covering is the implementation integrity. Implementation integrity answers another question. Is the control technically configured correctly? Many controls fail not because design is flawed, but because configuration is incomplete. Examples include multi-factor authentication covered but not enforced for administrators, logging enabled but privileged commands are not captured, firewall rules configured but with an overly broad scope, and vulnerability scans are running without authentication credentials. Implementation weakness will create false assurance, and the environment will appear to be controlled, but risk reduction will always be incomplete. Up next, we have the third dimension, which is operational consistency. So a control that works occasionally is not a reliable control. Auditors examine historical operation, not just point-in-time configurations itself. Examples include log reviews that are being performed inconsistently, patch cycles delayed during busy periods, and access reviews are being postponed. Consistency defines reliability. Reliability defines the assurance. Up next, we have the fourth dimension, which is the failure detectability. This is the most overlooked dimension amongst the 4 of them. Failure detectability answers the question, would management know if the control has stopped working? Consider the following. If the log forwarding stops, who is noticing it? If vulnerability scans are skipping assets, who is detecting it? If backup jobs are failing, How quickly is that identified? If firewall rules are changed unexpectedly, how is that being detected? Many environments rely on controls without monitoring the controls themselves. A control that cannot detect its own failure is not a control, it's an assumption. Strong environments detect control failures early, where environments will discover failures during the audit, or worse, during incidents. At this point, it is useful to take a step back and understand something fundamental about audits. Regardless of the framework being assessed, whether it is PCI DSS, ISO 27001, SOC 2, RBI cybersecurity framework, or any internal security standards, auditors ultimately evaluate the same three risks. Every technical control maps back to one of these risks. First up, we have the risk for unauthorized access. So unauthorized access refers to situations where individuals gains access to a system or a data beyond their authorized scope. This may include external attackers gaining access to internal systems, former employees retaining the active accounts, privileged users exceeding their intended authority, and service accounts being misused. Most access-related controls exist to prevent unauthorized access. For example, identity and access management controls, multi-factor authentication, privileged access governance, network segmentation, password policies, role-based access control, etc. If we specifically talk about compliances, PCI DSS requirements 7 and 8 focus heavily on access control, whereas ISO 27001 Annex A, access management controls address similar risks. If access governance weakens, exposure increases immediately. Most successful breaches begin with a legitimate credential. Attackers increasingly rely on stolen or misused credentials rather than direct exploitation, which means identity governance has become one of the most critical technical control areas. Up next, we have the second major risk that auditors evaluate, that is undetected incidents. This risk relates to the organization's ability to identify abnormal activity or compromise. If detection capability is weak, compromise duration will always increase, right? And breach duration is directly correlated with the breach impact itself. Most detection related controls exist to reduce incident detection time. For example, logging and monitoring, SIEM platforms, alerting mechanisms, endpoint detection tools, etc. If we go into the depths of the standards with respect to undetected incidents, PCI DSS requirement 10 is dedicated entirely to logging and monitoring. ISO 27001 logging controls address similar detection requirements, and SOC 2 monitoring criteria emphasize detection capability itself. Without detection, incident response becomes reactive. Undetected compromise is uncontrolled compromise, right? So organizations sometimes underestimate the detection importance because detection does not prevent the attack, but detection limits the damage, and limiting damage is essential for resilience. The third major risks auditors evaluate is the operational disruption. Operational disruption refers to the organization's ability to maintain service availability and recover from failure. This includes system failures, data corruption, ransomware incidents, infrastructure outages, human errors, etc. Availability related controls exist to maintain operational continuity. For example, backup systems, disaster recovery procedures, redundancy architectures, failover mechanisms, recovery testing, etc. ISO 27001 availability controls focus heavily on recoverability, and SOC 2 availability criteria focuses on service continuity itself. Backup systems are often treated as a compliance requirement, but from an auditor standpoint, they represent resilience capability. Backups are not a security control, they are a survival mechanism. If recovery capability is weak, operational disruption becomes prolonged disruption. These three risks from the foundation of every audit: unauthorized access, undetected incidents, and operational disruption. Every technical control we discuss today ultimately reduces one of these risks. And if a technical control does not demonstrably reduce one of these risks, it does not provide meaningful assurance. Tools do not reduce risk. Correct configurations within those particular tools will help with risk reduction. This risk model explains why auditors insist on technical depth, because technical controls are where risk reduction becomes measurable. All right. Moving on, logging and monitoring form the foundation of detection capability inside any environment. From an auditor's perspective, logging is not primarily about compliance requirements, it's about visibility. Without reliable visibility, organizations cannot detect misuse, compromise, or operational failures. Logging provides three critical assurances, that is traceability, accountability, and incident reconstruction. Traceability allows us to follow activity across the systems. Accountability will help us to associate actions with the identities. Incident reconstruction allows us to understand what actually happened. Without these three capabilities, incident response becomes speculation rather than investigation. This is why frameworks emphasize on logging heavily. For example, PCI DSS requirement 10 requires logging of authentication events, administrative actions, and even access to cardholder data. ISO 27001 logging controls require event recording and monitoring, whereas SOC 2 monitoring criteria emphasizes on the detection capability itself. But auditors do not stop at verifying that logging is enabled or not. We evaluate logging across several layers. First up, we evaluate the log coverage. Critical infrastructure must generate logs. This includes authentication systems, firewalls, databases, applications, administrative activity, etc. Partial logging always creates blind spots for an organization's environment, and blind spots create uncertainty. In one assessment, server logging was fully implemented, whereas firewall logging was fully implemented, but database activity logging was disabled due to performance concerns. The result was partial audit trails. Critical data access events could not be reconstructed. The environment appeared mature, but traceability was incomplete in that particular case. Next up, we evaluate log integrity. Logs must be protected from modification. If privileged users can alter logs without traceability, accountability collapses. Secure environments forward logs to centralized systems with restricted access. Weak environments store logs locally. Local logs create a manipulation risk. Next up, we evaluate time synchronization. Without synchronized time sources, correlation becomes unreliable. Even small time differences create a confusion during an investigation. Up next, we evaluate monitoring processes. This is where environments most frequently weaken. Organizations often deploy SIEM platforms successfully, but monitoring procedures mature much more slowly. Common observations include alert thresholds are not turned, large volumes of low priority alerts are being raised, inconsistent log reviews are being conducted, and limited investigation documentation is present with the organization. Logging infrastructure without monitoring creates a delayed detection. Logging without monitoring is surveillance without response itself. Detection speed reflects governance maturity, and delayed detection increases incident impact, and increased impact increases the regulatory exposure as well. Logging reduces the risk of undetected incidents. Next up, let's examine how network controls reduced unauthorized access. From an auditor's perspective, firewall configurations are among the most revealing technical artifacts in any environment, right? So firewall rule basis reflects the history of an organization's operational decisions. They reveal how access is being granted, how exceptions are being handled, how temporary changes are being controlled, and how risk is being tolerated. Well-governed environments maintain structured rule bases. Weak environments accumulate rules over time without validation. PCI DSS requirement one places heavy emphasis on firewall governance and segmentation, because segmentation limits the breach impact itself. Strong segmentation contains compromise, whereas weak segmentation allows lateral movement within the environment. When auditors evaluate firewall environments, the first step is reviewing rule justification. Every firewall rule should exist for a defined business purpose. Rules without justification represent unmanaged risk. Next, we review the rule scope. Overly broad rules weaken the segmentation of any particular environment. Examples include entire subnet access, large port ranges within a rule set, any source definitions, and any destination definitions within the rule set of the firewall. Broad rules simplify configuration, but they reduce assurance. Any-to-any rules are rarely technical mistakes. They are governance decisions. All right. Up next, we evaluate exception control. Temporary access is a necessary part of operations, but temporary access requires expiration and review. In one audit, a vendor access rule created for troubleshooting remained active for nearly 2 years. The rule had been forgotten, but it remained persistent for the persistent exposure point. Next up, we start with the evaluation of the segmentation validation. Architectural diagrams are not sufficient evidence. Segmentation must be technically validated. This may include access testing, rule verification, and network validation, etc. Segmentation is a commitment strategy, not architecture. When segmentation fails, breach scope expands rapidly, and expanded breach scope increases compliance exposure altogether. Firewall governance ultimately reflects operational discipline, and operational discipline determines resilience. Firewall governance define network boundaries, identity governance define access boundaries. Now let's move on to the next point that we will be covering in this particular webinar, which is identity and access management. All right. So identity and access management represents the foundation of control environments. Most successful attacks today do not rely on complex exploits. They rely on legitimate credentials. This makes identity governance one of the most critical areas auditors evaluate. Access control determines who can interact with systems. If access governance weakens, most downstream control weakens. Auditors evaluate access governance across several areas. First, we evaluate least privilege, in which users should only have the access required for their particular job role or business role. However, access tends to expand gradually. Access accumulation through role changes, temporary assignments, project-based access, administrative convenience, etc. Without periodic validation, privilege levels expand unnoticed. Next up, we evaluate privileged access governance. Privileged accounts introduce elevated risk because they can bypass controls. Auditors evaluate administrator inventories, access restrictions, users monitoring, multi-factor authentication enforcement. Privileged accounts without multi-factor authentication represent significant exposure. In one of the assessments, multi-factor authentication was implemented for standard users, but administrator accounts were excluded due to automation discrepancies. The highest risk accounts had the weakest protection. Next up, we evaluate shared accounts or generic accounts, right? So shared administrative accounts eliminate accountability. Shared credentials destroy the accountability of that particular account. Without accountability, traceability for that particular user account always weakens. Moving on, we evaluate the next point, which is the joiner, mover, and the lever process. So access must align with employment status and role. Auditors frequently compare termination records with account status. Even small delays reveal process weaknesses. Next up, we evaluate access reviews. Mature environments perform reviews using system-generated access listings. Weak environments rely on manually maintained spreadsheets. Manual tracking introduces inaccuracies. Access control is not an administrative hygiene. It is trust architecture. Identity governance ultimately defines the boundaries of the risk. Identity governance reduces unauthorized access, but even with strong access controls, technical weaknesses still exist. Let's examine how vulnerability management determines exposure. All right. So vulnerability management reflects operational discipline and risk ownership. Auditors evaluate vulnerability programs to determine whether exposure is actively being managed or not. The first area evaluated is the asset coverage. Scan must include all relevant assets. Auditors often compare the scan targets with the asset inventories itself. So coverage gaps indicate unmanaged exposure. Next up, we evaluate scan quality. So authenticated scans provide a deeper visibility. Unauthenticated scans detect only surface level issues. Without authentication, vulnerability visibility is incomplete. Next up, we evaluate the remediation timelines for a particular vulnerability. The policies define the remediation SLAs. Auditors compare vulnerability discovery dates with the closure dates itself. Inconsistent remediation indicates governance weakness. Next up, we evaluate the remediation validation itself. Closure must be verified through rescanning. Without validation, closure becomes an assumption. Up next, we evaluate risk acceptance. Some vulnerabilities cannot be remediated immediately. Formal risk acceptance demonstrates deliberate decision making, and absence of risk acceptance indicates an unmanaged risk. Running scan is an activity, whereas remediation is accountability. Mature programs demonstrate consistent remediation discipline. Weak programs demonstrate inconsistent closure patterns. Vulnerability management reduces exploitation risks, but even with strong patch discipline, failure still happens. That is where resilience and recovery determination determine survival. All right. Up next, we have backup and recovery controls that address operational resilience. Auditors focus on recoverability rather than the configuration. Backup configuration does not guarantee the recoverability capability. Restore testing provides the evidence for recoverability itself. Backup proves the intention. Restore test proves the capability itself. Auditors evaluate the restore testing evidences. Without restore testing, recovery capability remains uncertain. Up next, we evaluate the recovery objective. Recovery point objective defines the acceptable data loss. Recovery time objective defines the acceptable downtime. Auditors evaluate whether recovery objectives are achievable or not. Up next, we evaluate the backup protection. Backups must be protected from modification or deletion. Ransomware increasingly targets backup repositories itself. So immutable backup reduces this particular risk. Up next, we evaluate the offsite protection. Offsite backup protects against site level disruptions. Recovery capability determines resilience. Resilience must be demonstrated. Recovery determines resilience, but uncontrolled change silently weakens every control we discussed so far. Now, let's examine how change management preserves control stability. All right. Okay. So change management preserves control stability. Uncontrolled change introduces unpredictability itself, right? So auditors evaluate change processes to determine whether the environments remain stable or not. We review the approvals, testing evidences, impact analysis, and rollback planning done for the as per the change management procedure of any particular organization. Okay. Up next, emergency change often reveal process weaknesses. Like if we take one of the real life examples, in one of the audits, a firewall change implemented without review created unintended access paths for external users. So the change solved an operational problem, but introduced exposure to the environment itself. Stability is the silent pillar of compliance. So stable environments maintain consistent controls. Unstable environments will degrade gradually. Across all these controls, logging, firewall, IAM, vulnerability management, backup, and change governance, auditors consistently observe similar patterns. Across industries, similar patterns appear repeatedly. Controls exist but are weakly configured. Monitoring exists but is inconsistent. Tools exist but are not properly configured. Ownership is existing but accountability is unclear. Compliance activities become event driven rather than whereas these environments appear mature initially, but detailed testing reveals the weaknesses that particular environment has. Audit observations are rarely technical failures, they are consistency failures, and consistency defines the assurance. So after evaluating all these controls and observing these patterns across environments, we arrive at a very simple conclusion. Auditors do not insist on technical rigor to complicate compliance. Technical rigor is necessary because weak controls fail under pressure. Documentation cannot compensate for weak configuration. Monitoring cannot compensate for poor design. Policies cannot compensate for inconsistent operations. Configuration matters more than documentation, and monitoring matters more than existence. Validation matters more than assumption. Compliance is not the objective, control integrity is. All right. So as we were talking, so if we talk about where environment actually breaks, so common breakdown points that include weak configuration governance, delayed remediation cycles, monitoring gaps, access accumulation, etc. When we talk about compliance versus operational reality, compliance activities often become periodic. For example, organization focus more on evidence collection, audit preparation exercises, documentation updates. But risk management also requires continuous control operation, right? And continuous monitoring and validation as well. When we talk about the consistency principles, strong environments demonstrate consistent monitoring, access governance, change control, and consistency creates a reliability. Reliability will create that particular assurance for any particular organization's environment. So if we talk about the final perspective of this particular slideshow, so like the configuration matters more than documentation. Monitoring matters more than the existence of that particular control, and validation matters more than the assumption. Compliance is not the objective, whereas control integrity is, as I mentioned a few minutes back. So team, that was all from my end with respect to the topic, why technical controls make or break your compliance. Now, we can open the platform for questions if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask about this particular topic. Right. If anyone has any questions, they can put their questions in the chat box, and accordingly we can answer those particular questions. Right. Harshit, you can drop your question in the chat box and okay, so Shrish has asked the question, which controls are most challenging to verify? So Shrish, if you talk about, like, if I talk from my personal experience, it's not about whether it is challenging or not, but the logging and monitoring procedures that the organizations have implemented within their organization and their environments is one of the areas which I personally believes is most challenging to verify, because there is a lot of data, and as I mentioned in the in the PPT itself, there are a lot of logs that are not properly being synchronized within the organization's environment. So from my perspective, one of the most challenging controls that we can verify would be logging and monitoring. How do we prove effectiveness of a particular control when evidence has already been showcased or shared? So, Harshit, when it comes to the effectiveness of that particular control, what auditors are looking for is how exactly that particular control is being configured, right? So, for example, if we talk about the alert generation for administrative accounts, so if in case we are not properly configured in these particular cases where the logs of the activities happening through that particular administrative accounts are not being captured properly. In that particular case, that can create a problem. So in order to prove the effectiveness of that particular control, we need to showcase during the assessment activity or during the audit activity itself on that we have integrated uh, you know each and every line each and every user and each and every user account and the endpoint devices or any kind of components that are included within the infrastructure within the infrastructure with that particular SIEM solution itself. All right. We are receiving some more questions. Just give me a second, guys. It's taking a bit time to, load on my end. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay, so we have a question from Mr. Samarth Vashne. Hi, Nilab. Can you elaborate the difference between segmentation and segregation? Sure. That's a very good question. If I talk about a very simple difference, segmentation is dividing systems and networks, whereas segregation is separating the duties and the responsibilities of those particular systems. I hope that answers your question, Samar. Okay, so there's a question by Mr. Gautam. What are the common challenges organization face while implementing PCI DSS version 4.0? Okay, so Gautam, when it comes to PCI DSS, like as of now, since the change, change has been received, the most common challenge that the organizations are facing is with respect to the targeted risk analysis, because they till now organizations have been conducting risk assessments or risk analysis based upon standards like ISO 27001, in which they are either taking an asset based approach or a process based approach. However, since the targeted risk analysis has been introduced by the PCI SSC within the standard itself, it's a bit challenging for the organizations to incorporate each and every requirement that is mentioned by the PCSSA in the guidance document, itself. So like right now, what I can see or what I have experienced from my end is the implementation of the targeted risk analysis as a process in the organizations is one of the risks that they are facing as of now. Okay, next we have a question from Mr. Dhruv Agarwal. How do we validate the accuracy of any implemented control, like whether the access control implemented is sufficient or further controls are needed? Okay, so Dhruv, as I mentioned during the webinar, when we talk about controls like access management, all access control is being implemented like access if access control is implemented and each and every review like access reviews are being conducted properly, and temporary like users with temporary access are being handled properly in the way all these particular controls needs to be checked, like we need to check these particular controls during the audit assessment itself, so that we know that the access control that has been implemented as per the documented policy is effective within the organization's environment. I hope that answers your question. Okay. Next question is from Mr. Prabnoor Singh. He is asking, "Hi Nilab, can you help me understand when organization should go for PCI DSS level 1 certification and when they should go for a PCI SAQ instead? Thank you." All right. So Prabnoor, PCI SSC, like if we talk about the level of the certification, PCI DSS level 1, PCI DSS level 2, 3, or 4, that particular thing will be determined based upon the transaction volume that a particular organization is is handling on a yearly basis, right? So if in case the organization is handling more than 6 million transactions in a particular year, in that particular case they should go for level 1, whereas if the transactions are below 6 millions, they can go for a level 2, 3, or 4, in which they can choose for SAQD. But there are other SAQs like SAQA, SAQAEP, and SAQB, SAQCVT, which are specific for basic type of merchants. They are not applicable on service providers. They are for specific merchants, information regarding which can be found on the PCISSC website itself. Thank you. I hope that answers your question. Okay, next question we have from Mr. Dhruv Srivastav is that being a QSA and having a substantial experience in conducting PCI DSS audits, do you feel there are still some scope of improvement within the standard, or maybe it's lacking somewhere in further strengthening its controls and CHT security? All right, Dhruv, that's a great question. So if we specifically talk about the PCI DSS standard, information security is not a small subject. It's a very vast subject. And if we talk about information security, we cannot, it's like 100% cyber security or 100%, security from any external attacks. When it comes to information security will always remain a myth, because there will always be, things that we can change about, we can implement within the environments, or that we can change within our environments to, strengthen its core security features itself, right? So obviously, like when it comes to the strengthening of the controls within the PCI standard, as of now, obviously, they are as per the current market trends, that there are the type of attacks that the organization might be facing, or the type of discrepancies that the organizations might be facing. So based upon that particular, point, the standard has been created. However, I believe the council itself is working on updating the standards every few years. For example, a few years back, I believe in 2022, we were working with the PCI DSS version 3.2.1, and last year and last to last year, people started migrating from 3.2.1 to 4.0 and 4.0.1, based upon the changes within the standard itself. So it's a continuous process. We can never be too sure about cybersecurity itself. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Dhruv. Okay, next question is from Ajinkya Kole. Hi Nilab, can you help me understand how can we confirm whether the changes implemented in an organization are 100% being tracked or not? All right. So, Ajinkya, I believe you are asking this particular question from an auditor's perspective, right? So, see, as auditors, it's our job to check each and every technical control, each and every logical configuration that the entity that is being assessed has implemented within their organization, right? So now, it totally depends upon how deep can you go within those particular controls, right? So if we talk about if we talk about assessing or auditing a cloud environment for an organization, you can check the IAM console, or the Active Directory that a particular organization is using. Now, based upon that, if we talk about access control itself, whether or not they have segregated the roles and responsibilities of the users, whether the users can use, is a specific particular user able to connect to any particular service that they are not allowed to access, or anything like that. So it's totally up to the auditor on how in depth they can go, how each and everything that is being showcased by the entity or by the auditee, and everything that is being explained, how properly are you able to listen to it, and how properly you are able to check each and every point within the explanation and the environment that is in front of you. All right. All right, so guys, we have time for a few more questions. So if anyone has any questions, they can ask in the chat box itself. All right. We have another question by Mr. Mohit Rana. Mohit Rana is asking, Hi Nilav, how does tokenization enhance PCI DSS compliance? That's a good question. If I give a direct answer to that particular question, tokenization, it reduces the exposure of the actual cardholder data and significantly shrinks the scope of the cardholder data environment that the organization is getting, like, which is in the scope of the organization's assessment. So that's how tokenization will enhance the PCI DSS compliance. All right. We have another question by Miss Shubhangi Sharma. She's asking, Hi Nilab, which PCI DSS requirement is generally the most difficult for companies to implement and maintain? Okay, so Shubhangi, it totally depends upon the organization and the business of the organization. What exactly they like, what kind of business the organization is in, right? Now, if we specifically talk about PCI DSS, okay. So now, if we specifically talk about PCI DSS, the requirements, the standard itself has, the 12 requirements, and each and every requirement explains what exactly the defined approach for that particular requirement should be, right? So if in case the organization follows that particular defined approach properly, and they are able to implement each and everything within the defined approach, that is fine. But most commonly, what I've seen, as I mentioned earlier as well, if we talk about requirements itself, logging and monitoring is like requirement number 10. Logging and monitoring is one of the requirements that I see most of the vulnerabilities or most of the gaps from my perspective, or from my experience. I detect most of the gaps within the, like, with respect to the 10th requirement of the PCI DSS standard itself. Shwangi, I hope that answers your question. All right. So, team, now we will be taking one last question. If anyone has any questions, kindly let me know. All right. We have a question from Miss Ghazal. Hi, Nilab. In your view, what key enhancement could make PCI DSS more adaptive and resilient to evolving cyber threats? Hmm. Okay, that's a good question. So, see, PCI DSS has evolved significantly with with the latest versions. But to stay truly adaptive against modern threats, it needs to move further towards the continuous intelligence-driven and automated compliance itself, right? So, I hope that answers your question, Ghazal. All right. All right. So, firstly, I would like to thank each and every one of you who has joined this webinar today, discussing why exactly technical controls can make or break any organization's compliance. If in case any one of you has any further questions, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and we can discuss your questions or your queries over there. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.